Come on in, come on in. We'll wait just one more minute as everyone's joining the room. While you're waiting, drop in the chat your name, where you're joining from, and what's one cultural, dimension that you align with today. And our guest speaker also would like to know if you're a public librarian, academic librarian, school librarian, educator. I know we have some good sunshine here in Lexington, Kentucky. Just really beautiful today.
We do too in Maryland, actually. I think it's in the 60s today, or getting up to the 60s.
Oh,
I haven't been
yes.
outside since this morning, so I'm not sure, but definitely sunny, warmer than usual. Oh, I do see the chat here.
Beautiful. So welcome to Conversations for Action. I'm Regina Washington, Director of Rural Impact Networks at Partners for Education at Berea College. And today for the March Rural Library Conversations for Action webinar, I'm joined by Gina Kalia-Lotz, Coordinator for Library Reference and Instructions at Harford Community College in Bel Air, Maryland, where she has worked since 2011. So excuse the actual Hartford on the slide, but it's Harford. She's the author of the American Library Association brief, Keeping Up with Culturally Responsive Teaching, among other literary achievements. Today, we'll focus on the general, today the conversation will focus on the general principles of culturally responsive teaching, which include understanding multiculturalism, diversifying teaching methods, and using learner-centered instructional design. Gina will give us an overview of some of the reasons for importance of culturally responsive teaching, including the concept of otherness and the changing demographic trends in the United States. And we'll discuss the relevance of culturally responsive teaching to rural practitioners in particular. We hope that you will ask questions, drop your questions in chat or the Q&A. And we hope that you will take away practical strategies you can use to become more culturally responsive in your teaching, and leave with the understanding of connecting, or the understanding between the connections, the connection between good instructional design and cultural responsiveness. Welcome, Gina, to the show. How are you?
Thank you.
And please tell us a little bit about yourself, and tell us a little bit more about this culturally responsive teaching.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I was flattered, really, when Ms. Washington contacted me to speak on this topic. To be honest, I had written a short article in the Keeping Up with publication for ALA, American Library Associations, back in 2016, then got pulled into lots of other projects, including co-chairing 2 accreditation processes on campus, and also being interim library director for a short time at the library, and really hadn't been doing much research on this. But so I kind of mentioned that, but she said, no, what you have in your article is great, just present on that, which prompted me to then kind of dust off my articles that I had read, to prepare that article, and started reading some new things that have come out since then too. And it renewed my interest in this topic and reinvigorated my interest in pursuing this more. So I really thank you for kind of waking me up from my slumber and getting me back into this, because I'm having some ideas now of what I might want to research further. So my role is, I am the coordinator for our library's reference and instruction at Harford Community College. I was originally just coordinator of instruction when I wrote the article. So my focus is, through my career as a librarian for 20 years, really has been instruction. And that's really where my passion is, teaching and instructional design. So that's kind of where I mostly focus in talking about cultural responsiveness. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basics. It's really, there's so much to say about it, and we can't cover it all in 40 minutes or so, but hopefully, I don't know if it's something everyone's already familiar with, so or it's brand new to everyone. So I'm going to kind of start from the beginning, but also talk about some practical things, mainly related to instructional techniques. So let's get started with that. And gonna advance my slide here. So there's my title slide, Culturally Responsive Teaching in Libraries. And at the time, I had been reading up a lot on different teaching methods, and instructional design has always been my interest. And I was interested in culturally responsive teaching. And I thought, I didn't see a lot related to libraries specifically with this. I mean, something that maybe more in K through 12 schools, a lot more, but at the college level, not as much at the time. Now a few new things have come out, but and so I thought it would be a good topic to put out with the Keeping Up With publication. They hadn't covered this yet, and kind of, thought this was maybe kind of an up and coming thing. And then suddenly in the last year or two, I actually was contacted a couple of times with people who found that article. It's become even more suddenly on people's radar, thinking about cultural responsiveness and culturally responsive teaching. And I think with all the social justice kinds of events that have taken place, it's become of more interest to more people, which is great. So I'm going to start with the basics of what is culture. And this is from one particular article that I kind of like the way they summed up sort of like the structure of culture. So there are different aspects of culture. One is from this particular article by Allard et al. Is objective culture, which is, that culture's particular languages, specific facts about that culture, the history. Then you have more of the subjective culture, these authors called it, and that's more of the values, beliefs, behaviors, and those tend to be passed down from one generation to the next. Then you have what they call the lived experience, which is something that's more dynamic. Culture is ever changing. It also is based on that individual's interactions with the situation or with external things such as social and political events that take place. So knowing that as kind of those different aspects of culture, I think is important. I thought was important to keep in mind, because there's no way as librarians or as educators that we're going to know about every single culture and all of the nuances of every single culture. That's not the point. It's not to be an expert on specific things related to all the cultures, but just knowing that these are different parts of what make for culture. And then you can start to sort of observe those things when interacting with patrons or interacting with students, and just thinking about it in this framework, I think, is helpful. So what is culturally responsive teaching? This is kind of the history of where a lot of these ideas came from. One author who's cited often in the literature, current literature, is Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And actually I have a copy of it here. I just got through interlibrary loan because we did not have this at our library. And I haven't read it specifically yet, but he's often cited. So the English translation was written in 1970, and he criticized the traditional means of teaching. It was very teacher directed, kind of the sage on the stage manner of teaching, which we're probably mostly familiar with, or it was the way we were raised in school, right? The teacher lecturing, especially the college level, and you just listen and you record what you're told. And he was criticizing that back in the late 60s and 1970s. And he really was connecting teaching as with being a political act. And so that's kind of like he's cited now because that's a very kind of I think forward-thinking thing to be at the time. The actual terms culturally responsive kind of evolved from Gloria Ladson-Billings in 1994 called it culturally relevant teaching, which was really mostly focused on kind of using cultural references in your teaching, and how that empowers students. So using examples, multi-ethnic names or scenarios that aren't just sort of maybe the standard middle-class white types of scenarios, but like trying to be more diverse in your examples. And they call that culturally relevant teaching. Geneva Gay built on that and changed the terminology to be culturally responsive. So it's not just about being relevant, but you're actually responding to the individual students kind of in real time. And and incorporating those students' backgrounds into your teaching. So you're using the cultural characteristics, experiences, and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more effectively. So that's really reaching back to not just kind of lecturing or you as the instructor as kind of directing the teaching, but actually incorporating the students' backgrounds more into the teaching, being responsive to the individual students' responses themselves, their comments, their questions, their examples. And also saw a reference to this was in some notes that I had from a conference that said it was from the Maryland State Department of Education, but thinking of teachers and librarians as cultural workers and as intercultural leaders, that just in our very roles and how we work with patrons, that is really a role that we take on. And there's a link here to this article on the Intercultural Leadership Toolkit for Librarians that I think what is a nice kind of summary of some of the things to think about in being socioculturally literate and interculturally literate that I have right here. And they really outline, I think that those are the perspectives I mentioned in the beginning about culture, objective, subjective, and the lived experience culture, and then specific tools or things to think about as librarians in relation to culturally responsive teaching. So that's a good article to look at, and it'll be linked there in the PowerPoint. It was really one of the few articles I had that I could provide a free link to. Most of the articles I had came from our databases or interlibrary loans. So, but that one is freely available on the web. So why culturally responsive teaching? What is the importance? One thing is just demographic trends, and our world is becoming more diverse. Our society is becoming more diverse, I should say. Our country is becoming more diverse. And specific statistics here from the Census Bureau is that beginning in 2045, non-Hispanic whites will no longer be considered to be the majority of the US population as a whole. I think it's going to be something like 49.9%, but it's still, for the first time, projected to reach below the majority, which is what we consider, non-Hispanic whites are the majority, but they technically will not be statistically the majority at that point. But even more impactful, if we look at children, by 2020, non-Hispanic white children under the age of 15 made up less than 50% of the US population already. So that's where the projection comes in, is that for children under the age of 15, it's already, as of 2020, under 50% of our US population. And by 2060, it's projected that 2/3 of children in the US will be a race other than non-Hispanic white. So just our society it has become more diverse, or even to say, what we consider to be the majority in our country is changing, at least in terms of demographics, and not necessarily in terms of culture. But so, and then just so specific to my college, Hartford Community College, and I'm not really looking at the chats because it's hard for me to present and look at the chat. So if people have questions and you see something, feel free to, bring it up if it's something I should respond to right now. But specifically here, we have seen an increase in the number of minority students at our college. So specifically from 10 years ago, it was 26.4%. And now as of the previous academic year, it was 32.2%. So we're seeing, a slight but consistent increase in the number of students we consider to be minorities. It is still majority white in our area, but we are sort of a suburban / rural area though. And so there's definitely diversity in terms of socioeconomics and a lot of first generation college students as a community college. So we have different kinds of diversity in that regard, and also age. We have a diversity of non-traditional age students. We have, a higher percentage as a community college. Another thing to keep in mind is this assumption of otherness. This is really, I can't remember where it originates from, the idea of otherness, but it's definitely in literature, in anthropology and sociology, is the idea of the other. And it just basically is talking about the fact that, there's this assumption that those who don't fit into what we consider to be the dominant group in our society or dominant culture in our society are considered to be the others, right? So they're the ones that we would say, well, we need to try to we need to learn to appreciate people of other cultures. We need to try to appreciate diversity, these others, right? But they're always kind of outside of what we consider to be the norm or the right way, right? But we're, so we've learned to be sensitive to others, right? So, but that's still thinking of these people as not quite the norm, right? Or the assumed common way of our society. So, we want to help them belong to this, what's considered to be the norm, but they're still other, so thinking about that, that's problematic as it is, but, so it's a start to sort of say, hey, we want to at least let these people feel included, but we're still already kind of excluding them by considering them to be something other. So that's just a sort of problematic thing to think about. And the fact that, so that's where the assimilation comes in. You are going to assimilate if you're not of the norm of the dominant group. You are to assimilate and become like us, right? And that's just culturally how we've always thought about others, right? So, but with that, the dominant ideologies embody power and influence in our society, and so our very structures are based on those assumed cultural expectations. Cultural behaviors, those things that make up culture. And so that's going to be the culture that has power and influence, that's going to influence the very structures and policies and practices of all of our institutions, including our educational institutions, including our libraries. And it's something that is sort of invisible. If you belong to that dominant culture, it just feels comfortable. It's just what you're raised to know and think about. But there are subtle differences to the way different people from different cultures are raised to think about certain things. And sometimes those things don't align perfectly with the expectations of, how you behave in school, or what college is about, or what you're supposed to do to be, competitive and to achieve, and all of those things. It's kind of like needing to learn those rules if you're not raised just naturally with those ideas. And that leads to an inherently inequitable education system. And again, it's so subtle that sometimes it's hard to say, well, why are these people not succeeding? We're giving them all, everything everybody else has. But if you're starting from a place where you already are lacking certain understandings or certain expectations of how to behave, you're already at a disadvantage if you're not from that dominant ideology and dominant culture. Okay. Another reason for culturally responsive teaching is it's just been shown in studies, many studies over and over again, that students succeed better and have more intrinsic motivation when you can incorporate their lived experiences into their learning. And that just goes for everybody. But and so a lot of what I'm talking about, and I'll get to that with the skills, this is really all about good teaching practices and good teaching methods. And really they align perfectly with being culturally responsive in general. So, when students incorporate their lived experiences and frames of reference, academic knowledge and skills are situated within those lived experiences, students are more when academic knowledge skills are situated with the lived experiences and frames of reference students, they are more personally meaningful, have higher interest and appeal. I think the academics are more personally meaningful and have higher interest and appeal, and are learned more easily and thoroughly. I feel like the sentence isn't written well, but that's my fault. There are positive relationships between diversity experiences and student learning outcomes. A sense of control over one's learning is a strong predictor of in-class and out-of-class student involvement. And it empowers students to use their cultural knowledge and experiences as a vehicle for learning. And on top of that, students also develop their own cultural and socio-political competence. So it's kind of twofold in that being culturally responsive, we as instructors or educators, librarians, are developing our own cultural and socio-political competence. We're becoming more culturally competent in our practice. But students themselves are also learning that same kind of competence and understanding about culture. Latz and Billings proposed that culturally responsive teaching includes a willingness to nurture and support cultural competence and the development of socio-political or critical consciousness. And Frere pointed to close links between education and sociopolitics. Students and teachers develop a critical consciousness through reflection and action. So students and teachers are really learning together, and that's really what learner-centered teaching is about, which I'll get into in a little bit. So some practical strategies. And again, really all of these things are really just good teaching practices. That's what I found as somebody who focuses on instruction. When I was reading about culturally responsive teaching, I just said, but this is just good practice in general. And it just all makes sense. But the benefit is that you're also helping students from non-dominant minority groups to be more successful too. So, oop, my little thing's covering up. Let's see what it says here. So one thing that we should do as educators and as librarians is to understand what is multiculturalism. So I started with the slide about what is culture. And becoming sociocultural literate. I have an article listed in my bibliography at the end about what that entails, but understanding what cultural diversity means. It's about demonstrating uses for research in a variety of contexts, and cultural values, traditions, communication styles, learning styles, and more have direct implications for teaching and learning. And just understanding that those differences exist in different cultures and how they exist. So one of the articles, I believe it's the one that I linked in the front, really talks about some of the specifics of that. So some cultures, for example, are considered to be more individualistic, while others are believed to be more collective. And again, these are generalizations, but you know, in the United States, we're very individualistic society, right? It's about individual success, and there are the dominant groups that founded this country, you know, really prized individualism, right? We're based on individualism, but students from many other cultures, that is not how they're raised. It's about the collective. It's about, you know, belonging to a group and all working together for the success of the group, as opposed to that individual competition that is just, you know, the underpinnings of our society in the US. But if you're coming from a different culture, you may have trouble with kind of that assumption at the college level specifically of, or even in K through 12, of individual success and competition. There's also in communication styles. Some cultures have low context communication and some have high context communication. And actually individualistic cultures tend to have low context communication, which means that, you know, what is stated is so. Whereas other cultures have more of a high context communication, where some things are expressed more in gesture or facial expression, or certain understandings of what certain things mean without having to state everything really specifically. So and so all of it's connected. So, but just kind of knowing some of those generalizations, again, you don't have to know this culture does this and this culture does that and know every single, you know, have a chart of every single culture and what their communication style is. But just kind of knowing those are kind of some of the general differences that can exist, and then observing that sometimes in your patrons or your students, you can say, oh, you know, maybe I need to consider that. Like some students maybe don't feel comfortable answering my question in class, or don't feel comfortable, you know, raising their hand, but they may be willing to put that answer down on a piece of paper, for example. So things like that. I think I'm going off on a tangent, but let's see. So here comes the use of learner-centered and constructivist instructional design. So again, it's just rather than the teacher being the sage on the stage and things being teacher directed, you think of yourself as a facilitator of learning. You're no longer at the center or at the front of the room, but you're really facilitating the learning that's taking place at the student, in the student spaces. And that's really guiding them through from wherever they are. That gets into scaffolding, which I think is another slide. But students really need to discover the world for themselves and construct their own knowledge. And that's just constructivist learning, constructivist teaching, which again really goes for anyone, but you have better learning if you construct that knowledge for yourself, whatever that is. There are stats about what we learn based on something lectured to us and what we memorize versus what we actually kind of discover on our own, and we construct our own knowledge. And then that's going to be based on where we start from and our own individual experiences. But that's what constructivist knowledge is, constructivist learning is. So, you know, allowing students to pick their own topics for research assignments. Sorry, I have a lot of librarians sitting outside of me. I don't know if you can hear, but that is a simple thing that can be done at the college level. Again, I'm coming from a college library, that I have seen firsthand when students are able to pick their own research assignments, they are much more engaged, because they're picking something of interest to them. I mean, that just makes common sense. But by doing that, you're being culturally responsive as well, because you're allowing the student to use their own frame of reference and their own background to create a research topic, and just encouraging sharing of individual experiences and opinions. Um, Incorporating the students' backgrounds, a lot of this kind of overlaps, but just getting to know your students. Sometimes that's difficult if you're only going to see them one time in a library session or at a library program. So that's true. But you can kind of get a sense of, the demographics in your area, and kind of keep in mind some of the patrons who, who lives in your community, and maybe just kind of keeping that in mind with your programming and with your instruction. Using examples, as I mentioned in the beginning, that reflect students' backgrounds, using inclusive and sensitive sample topics and keywords, just kind of being sensitive to that, and thinking about, some students, I see it all the time. It's, for me, I see it on my own students, my white children's assignments, but I still think about it. Some of the questions that are asked, or some of the readings that are that they read, and I think, well, now if you didn't know that, if you didn't have that experience, how would you answer this question? There's so much assumption to what we have students read and answer questions to, that there's an assumption that students have had a certain experience, and they may not have. That's going to influence how they answer the question. So, thinking about just thinking about that if you're designing instruction. But it's important not to dumb down the curriculum. So sometimes that's been, people criticize like doing this kind of thing as dumbing down the curriculum. It's not about that at all. You want to have high expectations for all students, but you want to think about where students start from. So you start with small goals and scaffold or build upon student knowledge. So you have to kind of gauge, where is the student starting from? The best way to engage that is really to ask questions. And again, you might have a limited time with students, but when you kind of ask questions about what they think, like, again, I'm coming from a college library, but I might say, how many of you use the database, and, what was your experience with that? Or, what did you get out of this video that I showed? What kinds of things stick out for you? And then based on how they answer the questions, I kind of use that to guide my instruction. It's never, that's not what I was looking for. Like you ask a question, the student doesn't answer how you expect. It should never be, not exactly, not what I was looking for. It should be, that's an interesting point, and I could see how that could be if blah blah, and if such and such, or that would be a good answer to this or that question, or like that would be a good idea, and you just basically validate what they've said, even if it wasn't what you were expecting or didn't quite answer your question. But just doing that alone, it makes such an impact on students. For the student who answered a question, if they felt like they were told it was wrong, they're not going to answer a question again. They're not going to risk that. But if you validate what they've said, and just incorporate that into your teaching by building on that, or making it relevant in some way to your teaching, it makes all the difference. It really fills them with that sense of, like, you can just see it on sense of pride, or they feel good about that. And it's not that hard to do. It really isn't. So you're a bridge between students' pre-existing knowledge and their next level of understanding. And so it really has to start with lots of questioning, discussion, and just kind of building from there, incrementally. And if you don't hit the goal you had for the class, because the class didn't start there, that's okay. They still learned, and maybe it even went off on a different path than you were expecting. That's okay, because they still learned something. So, and then just diversifying your teaching methods. So active learning is always considered to be a better, it's really kind of standard now in schools, but having more active learning taking place in the classroom, hands-on learning, is just a better way for students to learn than lecture. It's just statistically true. Having small group work, the open-ended questioning, like I was mentioning. The group work allows students who maybe aren't going to feel comfortable answering a question in class, to be in a small group, maybe they feel more comfortable responding. It also helps them learn from the other students too. So small group work and just kind of incorporating different methods. Different things work for different students. Some like to do an individual worksheet, and so you can have that too. But you just kind of have a variety of activities going on in the class. Having alternative ways for students to submit responses or questions. So again, some may not feel comfortable speaking up in class, but you might have like a Google Doc where students could write answers to questions, and they'll feel more comfortable doing that electronically. And you can see their responses, but it's anonymous. Or they might feel comfortable just writing something on a piece of paper, like a worksheet. I always have. And then I said the group work was there, and just restating what you've said in multiple ways. If there's a lack of understanding, or you kind of gauge from your students' facial expressions or their body language, asking questions to gauge if they're understanding what you've said. Again, this is all just really good teaching practice, but all of this allows you to be more culturally responsive because you're catering to different learning styles and different cultural backgrounds in terms of communication. And then just a little bit as libraries, as we build collections and programming, this is probably a whole other area, but and I'm sure most libraries do this, but purchasing works written by diverse authors. I realize I haven't even been reading my notes. I'm just looking at the PowerPoint. I have more on here. Incorporating alternative and non-mainstream publication houses is part of that, including bilingual materials in your collection. Marketing the existence of these collections too is important, because they may be on the shelves, but not, put them in displays, make sure patrons are aware of them, and going beyond patron recommendations and popular readings, because usually we say get patron recommendations, but you may be getting recommendations only from certain people, or sometimes what they're recommending, they don't even know that there are other materials they could be recommending. So you as the librarian have to scout out, well, what else is there, and what how can I diversify my collection. And then sponsoring multicultural themed exhibits and programs that promote diversity whenever you can. And I expect most libraries are already doing that. And also, one thing I have here is to consider all forms of diversity. We're talking about cultural diversity. That could be ethnicity, race, nationality, socioeconomic status, rural versus urban. A lot of that can be considered to be cultural. And then other forms of diversity that aren't usually lumped in with cultural include sexual orientation, age, disability, etc. So those are forms of diversity as well to consider. And let's see, the rural connection. So of course, this was the rural network, and this was not necessarily something that I was really familiar with. I had one article I had been reading about that I have in my bibliography. I think it's called The Other R or something like that. Rural, the forgotten R. What is it? I forget now. Rural, the other neglected R. Making space for place in school libraries specifically, I found. But what is the rural connection? So I was trying to think about what specifically is it. Obviously, rural versus urban is a part of culture and cultural background, but what might be some of the problems? And I thought maybe I could just get kind of people's ideas too, since you're part of this network and much more familiar really with the issues than I am, not being part of this network. But some things I came up with were that culturally responsive teaching seeks to be inclusive and to combat stereotypes. And there are stereotypes about rural areas, about people who grow up in rural areas, that I'm sure are not always accurate. And of course, the idea of rural, I'm sure, is changing as well. So how do you combat those types of stereotypes about people who grew up in rural areas? That's something that you can try to tackle with having works written by rural authors or about rural areas that really challenge what maybe we think of as rural. And also, when we do a culturally responsive teaching, we're teaching students to think critically about place and what that means. I thought that issues of access and cultural exposure might be an issue, where students who are from rural areas maybe aren't exposed to the same and I'm making assumptions, but the same degree of diversity that you see in an urban area. You know, when you're in an urban area, there's a lot more people around, there's cultural events going on, you have more ethnic foods and restaurants maybe around, and maybe in a rural area, not as much. And so just your exposure in general to those kinds of things may be limited. And so how does that impact students and their learning and also their interactions with other students? So yeah, exposing students and patrons to rural narratives, if you can find them. Other thoughts, I guess I just put it out there because I figured you guys are really more the experts on this, and based on everything I've talked about, how could you see incorporating culturally responsive teaching, specifically with regards to rural libraries? And I see there are a bunch of comments. So I'm going to kind of try to look, but I hadn't been looking while I was presenting. So I guess they can just kind of put some comments in here. Oh, very familiar with Stereotypes of Appalachia. Yeah, and I've been reading about that a little bit more recently. I don't remember why I came across some article about Appalachia that was of interest to me, and definitely different from what, you know, again, the assumptions of kind of the backward thinking, but you know, some it's more diverse than I realized, Appalachia. And again, I grew up on Long Island in New York. I'm in Maryland, which where I work is sort of a semi-rural area, but I don't live in the area. I live in slightly more urban, closer to Baltimore area. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what people have to say, what they're thinking in terms of connections with rural culture. The toolkit was linked on an early page. I missed it. I think I'm guessing the PowerPoint will be shared. Oh, also my bibliography is at the end of this PowerPoint. So I think you'll have access to that. What else? We created an illustrated book project that included Colleton County artists and their lived experience are seen through the 10 books that they illustrated. That's really cool. Oh, thank you for posting the link. That is to the article, and they mentioned their toolkit, but the article itself has some really good information. And then they mentioned they're building a toolkit, but when I tried to find something else, I didn't find anything else that was more of a toolkit than the article itself. I may just not have found it. But yeah, the article is linked there. And I think it's nice. It's succinct and it's pretty gives specific concrete things. So I thought this was a good one. Maybe any thoughts about things? I know a lot of you were public librarians, so I was keeping that in mind while presenting, and maybe altered kind of what I said in terms of patrons and students. Oh, but I see, okay, work for Save the Children, focus on literacy. Oh, in rural areas. Yeah, so literacy, that is something, and I hadn't thought of that. Thinking about that in your teaching and maybe some lack of literacy skills, different ways to teach that aren't just involving reading too. So, you know, having multiple modes of presenting, I always have, I always say to the students, you can either listen to me if you're more of an oral learner, but I also have it all written on the worksheet if it's easier for you to read. I know for me personally, it's easier for me to read directions than to hear them. I just don't process it the same orally. I have trouble with webinars for that reason. If there's not a person speaking, I actually, you see, I use a lot of hand gestures. Okay, so my background, I have 100% of Italian descent, and we talk with our hands. And if I don't see that movement and expression from a person, I have a hard time following them. I don't know what it is. So again, a cultural kind of thing. But, you know, so they can read my directions, they can watch on the screen as I'm pointing to where they need to click, that kind of thing, or they can listen. And so just, you know, thinking about multiple modes of getting the information across. We usually have some video as well as, you know, some lecture, that kind of thing, and small group work, or they can work. Now, I used to, I basically, I make it optional now, especially with COVID and everything. But, you know, some students might not feel comfortable working in a group if they are in a class, they don't really know people really well. So I kind of make it an option. You can work with your partner if you feel comfortable, or you can work individually. And I think that's appropriate, especially in a library setting where the students they don't know me very well, and they might be kind of new to the class, haven't built that rapport. And so just kind of give them that option. Else, I'm in Anne Arundel County. Yeah, Maryland, where our county spans from rural to urban areas. I found interests in types of careers, employment have been a focus. Agricultural careers are popular in our rural areas, but not close to Baltimore. And as we promote resources, we have to keep that in mind. Yeah, so I saw there was somebody from Anne Arundel County, which is a county here in Maryland, and it's true. A lot of our counties are kind of really a mix here in Maryland. They can really span. Even I am in Baltimore County, not in the city, but Baltimore County spans from right at the edge of Baltimore City and pretty urban to farmland, north of the county. So, there's a lot of diversity in each county, really, here in Maryland. Mm-hmm. In Haiti, we are budget limited. Oh, Haiti, wow. We are budget limited, and there are a few Creole books. Yeah, and that was one thing I had in my notes, but I don't think I stated about allocating funding specifically for diversifying collections and diversifying programming. And sometimes that's hard. But I think if it's prioritized, it's something that has to be prioritized and basically lobbied for as something really important to do. So I think that's it for the comments at the moment. Oh, see another question and answer. The phrase "dumbed down" should be avoided. It gives the impression that the one that is speaking is saying it in a less smart way so that the person can understand, just has a negative connotation. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, like, I know that's a really awful term, but you often hear that, kind of used as criticism, like, we don't want to dumb down the curriculum for people who don't get it. And that's just so wrong. That's just such wrong thinking, because curriculum can actually be, as we stated, students actually have better success and learn more, all students, by diversifying the curriculum. They're learning about each other, they're learning about other cultures, they're developing their cultural literacy. So it's, it's just rethinking about, thinking that, and thinking about just combating people who might say something like that. But yeah, but restating things in a different way, that's not dumbing down the curriculum, right? You might need to use different vocabulary, restate things if, and that's, again, just good teaching. It's not in any way diminishing the intelligence of the people you're teaching, but knowing where they're coming from. And that some of what we're teaching is very jargony, or is very, specific to our field. People aren't necessarily familiar with it, and that's okay. But that's why you're teaching that. But you have to start with where they come from, what their frame of reference is. So you have to kind of determine that, and it's okay to just build from there. That's called scaffolding. Okay, so that was a question and answer. I think chats are kind of done. Let's see, did I have another slide on here? Oh, just some future directions. And I think we kind of already did some questions, so I think I have a few more minutes. But some future directions I have come across in the literature, just systematic programs to foster intercultural leadership in libraries. That includes hiring diverse leaders from diverse backgrounds, as well as helping to teach leaders about being interculturally literate. And that maybe starts with grad school programs for libraries, better incorporation of intercultural education in library grad school programs. I know that grad school programs are starting to really incorporate this more. Even the last 5 years, I've actually been kind of thinking about starting a PhD program at a local college that has one on leadership for changing populations, is actually the name of the degree. So just the fact that there's a degree called higher leadership and higher education for changing populations tells you that this is, really at the forefront in higher ed. But incorporating that in grad school programs, fuller realization of those principles that we went over of what culturally responsive teaching is in libraries. And that can be in teaching, but also applying to our library services in general, reference services or other services when we're interacting with patrons. In a lot of ways, we are teaching even through those interactions. And thinking about how do we apply that beyond just kind of classroom teaching. And I've been thinking about looking into this more and thinking about how do I connect a culturally responsive teaching with information literacy standards and learning outcomes specifically, because there's really a connection between being culturally literate or socioculturally literate and thinking about information literacy, because information literacy is about analyzing information. And so there are standards and goals really attached to that that have to do with thinking about critically about information. And so when we're thinking critically, we're thinking about where does information come from? What are the power structures that allow this information to be produced and disseminated? Who has power in that, in the information that gets conveyed? Who doesn't have access to information? So all of that is about information literacy, and I think it's very highly connected to culturally responsive teaching, and I kind of want to explore that more and think about that. But any other thoughts? And there's my bibliography. So a lot of these, again, are not necessarily freely available on the web, but so I got them through our databases and some interlibrary loan in some cases. And I think that's pretty much it for me. I put the link to my short article that was in the Keeping Up with Publication 2016 at the end there. But there's my email address. Feel free to reach out. I'd love to get to know some people here more. I'm really become interested now more in this rural connection too, and learning more about that. Thanks to being invited to this. So thank you so much for having me. I feel really honored to be here. I hope that you learned something, and I learned something too. So I really thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Gina. I definitely enjoyed it, especially how you really broke down some of those, concepts, terminology, and really looked at the application of this concept of culturally responsive teaching, and not only incorporating that into our everyday programming, and also looking at the collection of books that we have on display really matters, right? And not only just the, even beyond books, but looking at your work environment and how that is also in alignment with the culturally, responsive, culture, responsive environment that you're trying to create as well within your own libraries and also places of work. Really appreciate how you incorporated the rural culture and the relevance of rural culture within this whole idea of culturally responsive teaching as well, because again, a lot of us are from rural spaces, Appalachia also, who actually have been, in conversations about stereotypes quite often, and surely did appreciate some of the future directions of study that you could actually see down the pike that actually will continue to develop this whole idea of culturally responsive teaching in libraries, right? And really beyond that, what as you wrap up, what would you say the one most thing as we walk away in terms of looking at our instruction programs within public libraries? What could they do tomorrow if they really wanted to actually move to action?
Ooh, okay. And for public libraries specifically, working in an academic library, I feel like I'm not really an expert on public libraries and what you do as much. Although I have collaborated with our local public libraries, and I'm really impressed, honestly, with what our libraries are doing here in Harford County with their programming and such. So I don't want to in any way assume that you're not already doing things. But in terms of teaching, I think just becoming more, having more interactive and hands-on active learning types of instructional design behind what you do is paramount. Just moving from the idea of the instructor as sort of the director of the instruction, or kind of the sage on the stage, right, to use that phrase, but really that you're learning as well from your students and your patrons, that the teacher and the student are really learning together in this journey when it comes to instruction. So that sometimes you have to be comfortable with the fact that what you thought was going to happen in a particular instructional session or program isn't what happens, because the audience that was there is going to construct what happens. So when that happens, that's a good thing, because you know that you've actually incorporated those individuals in your group in a better way than if you were just presenting what was going to be presented, regardless of who was there. So if things go off in a tangent, or you don't accomplish everything you plan to, but there was active discussion and questions and people seemed engaged, then to me, that's more successful instruction right there. It doesn't matter that maybe you didn't tackle a few things that you were hoping to impart. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. And, before we close, I'd like to be able to talk a little bit about some announcements and some key events that are coming up. Next slide for me, please. Next slide, right here. So again, for those who have attended, thank you so much for supporting our Conversations for Action monthly. We encourage you to take a moment and become an official member of our Rural Library Network. As a member, there is many benefits that will definitely be appreciated, such as scholarships, funding opportunities, and other member-based types of resources that will go out, especially throughout this year. So take a moment, and you see the actual link here, berea.edu/PFE/RLN-membership. And take a moment and become a member of our Rural Library Network. Next slide, please. We're so excited also, one of our other networks that we work with is our upcoming Rural College Access and Success Summit, really focusing in on ensuring that rural youth have the opportunity to successfully transition from high school to college and also career. So we're really excited because this year we're going to be in person in Scottsdale, Arizona. Last year we had to transition our in-person summit to a virtual space, and this year we're committed to having an in-person summit in Scottsdale, Arizona, April the 24th through the 27th. Please join us. We are hoping to have a library focused track, as well as other particular breakout sessions. You won't regret it, especially it's sunny Arizona. You can't go wrong with that as well. So just wanted to give a shout out to that particular event that's coming up. And actually, I'm going to hand off to our partner from Save the Children, Leslie Graham, Senior Director, Community Impact and Rural Education. Leslie?
Thanks, Regina. What a great conversation today. And especially thank you to Gina for your presentation. On behalf of Save the Children, we are very excited to announce that registration for the 2022 Rural Child Hunger Summit is now live. Save the Children is proud to be co-hosting this national event with No Kid Hungry. It will be held virtually April 27th to 28th, so right on the heels of the Rural College Access and Success Summit. So we ask that you take a moment to register, share this far and wide. Anybody is welcome to attend. It is free, it is virtual. virtual. And the goal here is really to highlight the resiliency of rural communities through innovative and adaptive programs. So we'll have sessions that focus on unpacking the latest research, promising policy solutions, the role of schools, the role of libraries, the role of community-based organizations, local leaders to all work together to fight this fight against rural child hunger. So we're super excited about that. We'll also stick the registration in the chat box for easy access. And then on the next slide, we hope that you will also join us for next month's Conversation for Action. We are pleased to be presenting about summer. So yes, this is the season of summer. It's only March, but we're all thinking about summer. And so we invite you to join us same time, same place next month. We know libraries play a critical role in supporting children and families throughout the summer months, whether that be access to literacy resources, children's programming, feeding efforts, all the things that you all do each summer to support children and families. So yes, it's only March, but we are gearing up for summer. We have some really exciting funding opportunities that we'll be announcing exclusively for our Rural Library Network members. Actually upwards of $150,000 allocated to the RLN to support local summer reading and summer feeding initiatives. So we encourage you all to join next month's conversation to hear all about it. All right, how was that for a nice teaser, Regina? Over to you.
Oh my goodness, lovely, Leslie, love it. I love it. And you all got it firsthand from Leslie, over $150,000 worth of funding will be coming your way. Don't delay. Definitely sign up. It's a free membership. And I want to again, thank you so much, Gina, Kalia, Lotz. We really appreciated the conversation today, the discussion that we had today. Again, this is a discussion that we want to continue even within our own places and spaces. So as you have attended this webinar, thank you, attendees. Continue to support us. We'll see you next month. And as you continue to do your meaningful work in your own place and making a difference in the lives of children and community, ask yourself a question. What are some best practices that you can use to ensure culturally responsive teaching as you are creating the learning environments necessary for success? Continue to do great work. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. You take care now. Bye-bye.